Stand in Newgate Street today, and you'll find coffee shops and office workers hurrying past polished glass towers. The pavement smells of diesel and espresso. But rewind 700 years, and you would have found yourself ankle-deep in a river of blood and entrails, surrounded by the screams of dying animals and the stench of rotting flesh so thick it clung to your clothes for days. Slaughter, filth, disease, coin. Using cutting-edge AI reconstruction, we are about to walk you through every aspect of life in London's shambles. From the butchers who woke before dawn, to the churchyards built on offal, the laws written in blood to the word that entered the English language as a synonym for chaos itself. This was the medieval meat market that fed a city of 50,000 souls, a place where carcasses hung from iron hooks in open air, where the cobbles ran red every morning, where fortunes were carved from flesh, and where the boundary between butcher and executioner, between meat and man, grew thinner with every passing century. The shambles was not one street. It was a network of slaughterhouses, markets, and bone pits sprawling across the heart of the City of London, centered on a district that took its name from the Old English word fleshammels, flesh benches. This is the story of the people who lived and worked inside it. A butcher's day in the shambles began 2 hours before dawn. The household woke not to cockcrow, but to the bellowing of cattle being driven through Newgate from the fields beyond the city wall. John Haukyn, a master butcher documented in the 1340 Assize records, lived with his wife Agnes, 3 apprentices, and 2 journeymen in a timber-framed house on St Nicholas Shambles, the street named for the church that stood at its northern end. The ground floor was his shop. The upper floors were sleeping quarters. The cellars were storage for salted meat and tallow. The smell never left. In winter, it was tolerable. The cold slowed the rot. In summer, the stench was so overpowering that city ordinances required butchers to burn rosemary and wormwood in iron braziers outside their doors. It did little. Agnes Haukyn rose first, rekindling the kitchen fire with dried dung cakes, the cheapest fuel available. Breakfast was bread trenchers soaked in pottage, a thick stew of peas, onions, and yesterday's offcuts. The apprentices ate standing. By the time the first light touched the rooftops, the animals were already arriving. Cattle, sheep, pigs, and goats came in herds of 20 or 30, driven by drovers who had walked them from Smithfield Market a quarter mile to the west. The animals knew. The older ones balked at the gateway had to be beaten forward. The air filled with the sound of panicked lowing. The shambles had no abattoirs in the modern sense. Slaughter happened in open yards behind each shop, and sometimes in the street itself. Haukyn and his men worked with axes and long knives, the blades honed every morning on whetstones kept in buckets of water. A skilled butcher could kill a cow in under a minute. The axe blow to the skull, the throat cut, the gush of blood into wooden troughs that overflowed into the gutters, the carcass hoisted by rope and pulley to bleed out fully, then the flaying, the gutting, the separation of hide, tallow, and offal from saleable meat. Nothing was wasted. The hides went to tanners, the tallow to candle makers, the offal to pie sellers and dogs. By the time the sun cleared the rooftops of Cheapside, the shambles was already a scene of organized butchery on an industrial scale. Blood ran in the central gutter of St Nicholas Shambles, a stone channel that flowed downhill toward the River Fleet. On busy mornings, the gutter became a stream. The city's pigs, feral descendants of domestic stock, roamed freely, feeding on the scraps. An ordinance of 1297 banned pigs from the streets after one knocked over a child, but the law was never enforced. The pigs were useful. They ate what no one else would touch. To be a butcher in medieval London was to occupy a strange place in the social order. The trade was essential. It was also reviled. Butchers were wealthy. They were powerful. They were members of one of the city's oldest guilds, the Worshipful Company of Butchers, chartered in 1272. They sat on civic councils. They lent money to aldermen, and yet they were forbidden from serving on juries in homicide cases because the law assumed that a man who killed animals for a living was desensitized to bloodshed. The work itself required immense physical strength and a tolerance for sights that turned the stomachs of outsiders. A butcher's apprentice began his training at age 12 or 13, indentured for 7 years. The first year was spent cleaning. scrubbing the blood-stained benches, hauling buckets of intestines to the fleet, shoveling dung. The second year, he learned to skin. By the fourth year, he was permitted to make the killing cut. The guild enforced strict rules. Meat had to be fresh. Selling measly pork, infested with tapeworm cysts, was punishable by an hour in the pillory and the destruction of the entire carcass. Selling the meat of animals that had died of disease could result in expulsion from the guild and banishment from the city. Inspectors made surprise visits. In 1365, a butcher named William Sprawling was caught selling the putrid flesh of a cow that had drowned in the Thames. He was dragged to Cheapside, forced to stand in the pillory with the rotting meat hung around his neck and pelted with offal by the crowd. The guild kept order through violence. Disputes between butchers were settled in the street with knives. A 1326 coroner's inquest records the death of Thomas Le Mazelinet, stabbed in the throat during an argument over the price of a pig. The killer, another butcher named Richard de Staunford, fled to sanctuary in St Paul's Cathedral and never faced trial. Women worked in the shambles, though rarely as butchers. Agnes Haukyn kept the accounts. Other butchers' wives sold cooked meats, sausages, black puddings, and meat pies from stalls in Cheapside and Newgate Market. The guild forbade them from selling raw meat, a rule designed to protect the monopoly of male guild members. The penalty for a woman caught butchering was a fine of 40 shillings, more than a month's income. But widows were an exception. If a master butcher died, his widow could inherit his license and continue the business, provided she employed a journeyman to do the actual killing. The records list at least a dozen widows operating shops in the shambles in the 14th century. The tools of the trade were simple and lethal. The felling axe, 4 pounds of iron on a 3-foot handle. The sticking knife, 8 inches of blade kept sharp enough to part muscle from bone in a single draw. The cleaver used for splitting carcasses. The boning knife, narrow and flexible. A butcher owned his tools. When he died, they passed to his eldest son or his senior apprentice. John Haukyn's axe, mentioned in his 1349 will, had belonged to his father and his grandfather before him. The handle was blackened with decades of blood. The shambles was also a place of extraordinary waste. Offal pits lined the side streets. These were communal dumps where butchers threw unusable scraps, hooves, horns, bones too splintered to sell. The pits were supposed to be emptied weekly by city rakers. Men paid to cart refuse beyond the walls. In practice, the pits overflowed, rats swarmed. In summer, the smell was so foul that the church of St Nicholas Shambles, 10 yards from the nearest pit, burned frankincense during Mass to make the air breathable. In 1369, the city ordered the construction of a new offal wharf on the Fleet River, where barges could carry the waste downstream to the Thames and dump it at Deptford. The wharf was never built. The butchers refused to pay for it. The pits remained. The geography of the shambles was a labyrinth. At its heart lay St Nicholas Shambles, a narrow street barely wide enough for 2 carts to pass. It ran north to south, parallel to Newgate Street, and was lined on both sides with timber-framed shops, each with a stall projecting into the street where meat hung on iron hooks. The upper floors overhung so far that neighbors could shake hands from their windows. Above them, the gutters emptied directly onto the street below. To the west lay Butcher Row, an alley of smaller shops specializing in offal and cheap cuts. To the east, Bladder Street, named for the pig bladders that hung drying in the sun, later sold to children as balls or to apothecaries as containers for ointments. At the southern end of the district stood Newgate Market, a broad open square where butchers displayed their finest cuts on marble slabs every Friday. The market was loud. Butchers called out prices in a dialect so thick with trade slang that outsiders could barely understand it. A baron was a double sirloin. A chine was a backbone cut. Scrag was neck meat, sold cheap to the poor. The language of the shambles entered English. The word shambles itself, from fleshammels, came to mean any scene of blood and chaos by the 16th century. Shakespeare used it, so did Marlowe. The City of London regulated the shambles with an obsessive level of detail. Ordinances from the 1290s onward dictated where animals could be slaughtered, where offal could be dumped, and what hours meat could be sold. Butchers were forbidden from selling after sunset. because lantern light allowed them to conceal spoilage. They were forbidden from slaughtering within 50 feet of a church, though the rule was widely ignored. They were forbidden from letting blood run into the Fleet River, the narrow waterway that formed the western boundary of the Shambles. The Fleet was already the city's sewer. Tanneries and dye works lined its banks. The water ran black with effluent. Adding butcher's blood to the mix turned it into a stinking open trench that flooded during storms and spread disease. In 1307, the city built a covered stone culvert over the Fleet in an attempt to contain the stench. The culvert became a dumping ground. By 1350, it was so choked with offal and bones that it overflowed into the streets, and the city had to hire a team of rakers to dig it out by hand. The work took 6 months. The butchers were powerful enough to resist most restrictions. They bribed aldermen, they threatened inspectors. In 1327, a poultry seller named Walter Le Flesher was beaten unconscious by a gang of butchers after he complained to the mayor about the smell. No one was arrested. The Shambles was also a place of extraordinary wealth. A master butcher like John Haukyn earned between £10 and £15 a year, more than a skilled mason or carpenter. The most successful butchers owned multiple shops, renting them to journeymen and taking a cut of the profits. They loaned money at interest, a practice forbidden to Christians but quietly tolerated when the lender was a guild member. They invested in property. Haukyn's 1349 will lists 3 shops in the Shambles, a house in Cheap Ward, and a half share in a herring boat operating out of Queenhithe. The wealth was visible. Butchers dressed in wool dyed with expensive kermes, the crimson extracted from crushed insects. Their wives wore silk veils imported from Flanders. They endowed chantries, private chapels where priests said masses for their souls in perpetuity. The Church of St Nicholas Shambles was rebuilt in 1307 with funds donated entirely by butchers. The new building had stained glass windows depicting saints holding cleavers. The contrast between the butchers and their customers could not have been starker. The Shambles served a city where most people ate meat once a week, if that. A pound of mutton cost threepence, half a day's wages for a labourer. Beef was more expensive. Pork was cheaper but still beyond the reach of the very poor who survived on bread, pottage, and the occasional herring. The best cuts, loins, haunches, ribs, went to the tables of merchants and nobles. The poor bought umbles, the internal organs, or scrag, the neck and shank meat that required hours of boiling to become edible. On Fridays, the Shambles sold nothing. Fridays were fast days, and the eating of meat was a sin. The butchers closed their shops and attended Mass at St Nicholas. The streets fell silent. The blood in the gutters dried to a brown crust. And then on Saturday morning, the cattle came again. The people of the Shambles lived between 2 worlds, the sacred and the profane. The Church of St Nicholas stood at the northern end of the butcher's quarter, its tower visible from every shop. It was a small parish church rebuilt in stone in 1307 with a nave that could hold perhaps 200 people. The butchers filled it every Sunday. They sat together in the north aisle, a section reserved for guild members. The wealthiest butchers had their own pews carved with their names and trademarks, a cleaver, a felling axe, a ram's head. The church records list dozens of bequests from butchers. In 1312, Richard Le Bochet left 20 shillings for a new altar cloth. In 1328, John Summer left £5 for the repair of the bell tower. In 1349, John Haukyn left instructions in his will that his body be buried beneath the floor of the nave, as close as possible to the altar, so that every Mass said in the church would speed his soul through purgatory. The butcher's relationship with the church was transactional. They gave generously, and in return they expected the priests to ignore certain inconvenient truths. The Bible forbade the eating of blood. Leviticus was explicit, and yet the Shambles sold blood puddings, sausages made from pig's blood and oatmeal in vast quantities. The priests said nothing. The church also forbade usury, the lending of money at interest. The butchers lent money to half the tradesmen in the ward. The priests said nothing. The church forbade work on Sundays and holy days. The butchers slaughtered animals on Saturday nights so the meat would be fresh for Sunday sale. The priests said nothing. The church needed the butchers' money. The Shambles also had its own calendar of festivals. On the Feast of St Nicholas, December 6th, The butchers processed through the streets carrying a wooden statue of the saint, dressed in a bishop's robes and holding a cleaver instead of a crozier. They sang hymns, they distributed meat pies to the poor. They ended the day with a feast in the Guildhall, where entire oxen were roasted on spits and barrels of ale were drunk dry. On the Feast of St Bartholomew, August 24th, the butchers held a livestock fair in Smithfield, just outside the city walls. It was the largest meat market in England. Thousands of cattle, sheep and pigs changed hands. The streets around Smithfield became an extension of the Shambles, filled with drovers, dealers and butchers haggling over price. Fights broke out. In 1355, a drover was stabbed to death in an argument over a lame cow. The fair continued. The church taught that animals had no souls. They existed to serve man. To kill them was not a sin. And yet the butchers lived with a strange unease. Many refused to let their children watch the slaughter. Some made the sign of the cross before striking the killing blow. In 1348, during the first wave of the Black Death, a Franciscan friar preaching at St. Paul's Cross declared that the plague was God's punishment for the city's sins, and that the greatest sin was the shedding of innocent blood. He pointed toward the Shambles. The butchers responded by pelting him with offal. The friar fled. The Shambles also played a role in the city's execution rituals. The butchers supplied the tools. When a man was hanged at Tyburn or beheaded at Tower Hill, the axe or the cleaver often came from a Shambles workshop. The executioner was not a butcher, but he was trained by butchers. The guild taught him how to sharpen a blade, how to judge the weight of a blow, how to sever a head cleanly without hacking. In return, the executioner paid the guild a fee, and the guild received the body of the executed man, if it was unclaimed, to dissect for the training of apprentices. It was an arrangement that horrified outsiders but made perfect sense to the butchers. Flesh was flesh. The boundary between animal and human was thinner than people wanted to believe. And in the Shambles, where blood flowed every day, the rituals of death were simply part of the work. Marriage in the Shambles was a matter of property and survival. A butcher's daughter was a valuable asset. She brought a dowry. She brought connections to other guilds. She brought legitimacy. John Haukyn's daughter, Matilda, married a fishmonger in 1342. The union linked two of the city's most powerful food guilds. The wedding feast was held in the Butcher's Hall on Milk Street. 3 oxen were slaughtered for the occasion. The bride wore a gown of red wool, the color of the trade. The ceremony took place at the door of St Nicholas Shambles, as was the custom, with the priest blessing the union and the guild witnesses signing the marriage contract inside the church. Matilda's dowry was £5, a third share in her father's shop, and a promise that her husband would never be required to work as a butcher. The fishmongers considered themselves a cleaner trade. Love, in the modern sense, was not a factor. But affection grew. The records suggest that butchers' marriages were more stable than those in other trades. Widows inherited. Children were provided for. The Shambles was a family business, and the family was the unit of survival. A butcher's household was crowded. John Haukyn lived with his wife, 3 children, 2 apprentices, and a maidservant in a house of perhaps 800 square feet. The ground floor was the shop. The first floor was a single large room divided by curtains, where the family slept in box beds and the apprentices slept on straw pallets on the floor. Privacy did not exist. Children grew up surrounded by death. By the age of 5, a butcher's son had seen 1,000 animals killed. He knew the sound a pig made when its throat was cut. He knew the smell of a cow's intestines spilling onto the cobbles. He knew that meat came from living things and that living things died screaming. Some boys grew numb to it. Others never did. The apprentices came from butchers' families. A boy born to a butcher was expected to become a butcher. If he refused, he shamed his family. If he lacked the strength or the stomach for the work, he was sent to a lesser trade, a tanner, a glover, a chandler. The guild kept the trade within a small circle of families. The same names appear in the records generation after generation. Haukyn, Bocher, Sprawling, Mazzelina. The Shambles was a dynasty. Women in the Shambles had more power than in most trades. A butcher's wife kept the accounts. She negotiated with customers. She hired and fired servants. She disciplined apprentices. When her husband traveled to livestock fairs in the countryside, she ran the business. The The guild acknowledged this. Widows could inherit their husband's license and continue operating the shop, provided they employed a journeyman to do the killing. At least a dozen widows ran shops in the Shambles in the 14th century. Some remarried within the trade. Others remained independent for decades. The records list Agnes Haukyn running her late husband's shop from 1350 until her own death in 1367. She employed 2 journeymen, she paid her guild dues. She left a will bequeathing the business to her son. Childhood in the Shambles was short. Boys began apprenticeships at 12, girls married at 14 or 15. The city's mortality rate was staggering. 1 child in 3 died before the age of 5. The Shambles was no exception. The parish register of St Nicholas records burials of infants and small children in heartbreaking numbers. In 1340, John and Agnes Haukyn buried their infant son, also named John, in the churchyard. He was 6 months old. The cause of death was not recorded. It did not need to be. Death was ordinary. The Shambles was a place of disease. The stench alone was a marker of danger. Medieval medicine taught that bad air, miasma, caused illness. The Shambles reeked of decay. The offal pits swarmed with flies. The gutters ran with blood that festered in the summer heat. The city's physicians warned that living near the Shambles shortened life. They were correct, though not for the reasons they believed. The real killers were contaminated water, vermin, and the sheer density of animals and humans living in filth. Butchers died young. The guild records list dozens of men who died in their 30s and 40s. Some were killed in accidents, crushed by a falling carcass, gored by a panicked bull. Others died of infections. A small cut, contaminated with animal blood or feces, could turn septic. Within days, the flesh swelled and blackened. Within a week, the man was dead. There was no treatment. Surgeons lanced the wound and packed it with honey or wine-soaked linen. If the patient survived, it was by chance. Tuberculosis was common. The disease spread easily in the crowded, airless rooms where butchers' families lived. A man coughed blood for months, growing weaker until he could no longer work. His family cared for him until he died. Then they buried him in the churchyard and continued the business. Dysentery killed in waves. Contaminated water from the Fleet River or from the city's wells caused outbreaks that swept through entire neighborhoods. The symptoms were unmistakable: violent cramps, bloody diarrhea, dehydration, death within days. Children were especially vulnerable. The parish records list clusters of child burials in the summers of 1338, 1342, and 1347. And then came the Black Death. The plague reached London in the autumn of 1348. It arrived by ship from Calais, carried by rats infested with fleas that bore the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The disease spread with terrifying speed. Victims developed swellings in the groin or armpits, buboes that turned black and burst. They coughed blood. They burned with fever. Most died within 3 to 5 days. The Shambles was devastated. The density of people, animals, and filth made it ideal for the plague. Rats thrived in the offal pits. Fleas thrived on the rats. By November 1348, half the butchers in the district were dead. John Haukyn died on the 23rd of November 1349. His wife Agnes survived. So did their daughter Matilda. Their 2 sons did not. The guild records list 47 master butchers dead of plague in the winter of 1348 to 1349. The apprentices and journeymen died in even greater numbers. The Shambles fell silent. Shops closed, meat rotted on the hooks. Cattle wandered the streets, unfed and unslaughtered. The city ordered the surviving butchers to keep working, but there were not enough men. The guild broke its own rules and allowed widows and journeymen to sell meat without a master's license. The parish church of St Nicholas ran out of space to bury the dead. The churchyard was full. The city opened emergency burial pits outside the walls. At Smithfield and at East Smithfield near the tower, cartloads of bodies were dumped into trenches and covered with quicklime. The Shambles lost half its population in 6 months. By the spring of 1349, the worst was over. The survivors returned to work. The shops reopened. The cattle came again. But the Shambles was never the same. The guild was weaker. The city's population had fallen by 1/3. Demand for meat collapsed. Prices fell. Many butchers sold their shops and left the trade. The wealthiest families survived. The Haukyn shop passed to Agnes, then to her son-in-law. It remained in operation until 1367, when Agnes died and the property was sold to a fishmonger. The plague returned in 1361, and again in 1369, and again in 1375. Each wave killed fewer people than the first, but the cumulative toll was staggering. By 1400, the Shambles was a shadow of its former self. The great butcher dynasties were gone, the guild was diminished, the streets were quieter, and the city had begun to change. Stand in Newgate Street today, and you will find no trace of the Shambles. The slaughterhouses are gone. The offal pits are buried beneath office buildings and tube stations. The church of St Nicholas Shambles was demolished in 1547, its stones carted away to build Somerset House. The gutters that ran with blood are now underground sewers. But the word remains, Shambles. A scene of carnage, a place of chaos. The Old English fleshammels survives in the language, a ghost of the medieval market where fortunes were carved from carcasses and the air smelled of death every morning. The butchers fed a city, they made themselves rich. They left almost nothing behind, except the word, a district that refused to die.